All right, let's dive into something we all experience every single day but don't often think about: smell and taste.
Yeah, they just kind of happen, right?
Exactly. But in today's deep dive, we're going to use this physiology handout from Dr. Rasha Eldeeb to uncover just how complex these senses really are.
And trust me, there's a lot more to them than meets the eye, or the nose, or the tongue.
For sure. So get ready to be surprised. We're going to figure out how they work together, why a stuffy nose can make food taste so bland.
Ah, the dreaded cardboard food phenomena.
And did you know there's actually a fifth taste beyond sweet, sour, salty, and bitter?
There is?
Oh yeah, it's called umami. We'll get to that later.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's do this.
Okay, so first things first, smell and taste. They're like this dynamic duo constantly working behind the scenes to create what we know as flavor.
Right, like when we eat, we're not just tasting. We're experiencing this whole symphony of sensations.
Exactly. But we rarely think of them as a team until we get a cold. Then suddenly, bam! Everything tastes like cardboard. Why is that?
Well, both senses are detecting chemicals, essentially. But smell works kind of like a distance receiver, picking up those airborne molecules.
Okay, I like that analogy, a distance receiver.
Whereas taste, you actually need direct contact.
Ah, makes sense. So no smelling yesterday's leftovers across the room then. Which
Yeah.
is probably a good thing.
No, yeah, maybe.
But seriously, where exactly are these distance receivers in our noses?
Dr. Eldeeb's handout is great on this. It all happens in this tiny little area called the olfactory mucosa.
Olfactory mucosa.
Yeah, say that 5 times fast.
No way. So how tiny are we talking?
Only about 5 square centimeters.
Yeah.
And it's tucked way up high in the nasal cavity.
Wow. So it's this small but mighty spot. What's going on in there?
Well, it's home to these amazing things called olfactory receptors, which are these super sensitive nerve cells that actually catch those odor molecules.
Catch them? How?
They have this unique bipolar shape, and then these little hair-like projections called cilia. It's like they have these tiny little arms grabbing those odor molecules out of the air.
Okay, so imagine these little arms reaching out.
Yes, and when an odor molecule gets caught, that's when the real journey begins.
Okay, the journey. Take me on this journey.
So the signal travels from those receptors along these bundles of axons.
Axons. Remind me, what are axons again?
They're like the long, skinny part of a nerve cell that carries the electrical signal.
Right, right.
And these axons go right through a bony structure in your skull called the cribriform plate.
Wait, through the skull? That sounds kind of risky, doesn't it?
You'd think so. But then it gets even weirder. Instead of going to the thalamus, like most sensory information.
The thalamus being like the brain's relay station.
Exactly. But the smell signal, it totally bypasses that and goes straight to the olfactory bulb.
Wow, a VIP lane for smells.
I know.
There has to be a reason for that.
There is. It probably has to do with how crucial smell is for survival. Think about it. Detecting danger, finding food.
Right, makes sense.
So the olfactory bulb, this is where we start creating a kind of smell map in our brain.
A smell map. Okay, explain this map to me.
So there are these things called mitral cells within the bulb, and they receive tons of signals from those receptors, and that forms a kind of neural representation of each specific odor.
Oh, so each smell has its own unique pattern in our brain, kind of like a fingerprint.
Exactly. And then from the olfactory bulb, the pathway continues to the olfactory cortex. And this is where we actually consciously perceive, recognize and interpret the smells.
Got it. So it goes through a few stops before we actually realize, hey, that's cinnamon.
Right. And what's interesting is some signals also cross over to the other side of the brain.
Oh, like they switch sides.
Yeah. And that might be why smells are so strongly linked to memories.
That's so true. Like the smell of cinnamon always takes me back to my childhood.
See? It's powerful stuff.
It is. But something I've always wondered is, how do those molecules actually trigger the sensation of smell? Like, is there some kind of code?
Well, the chemistry of smell is surprisingly complex. There isn't a simple one-to-one relationship between, like, a molecule structure and its odor.
So there's no smell dictionary.
Not exactly. Some molecules just smell strong, They trigger a strong response.
Speaking of strong smells, Dr. Eldeeb mentioned that women generally have a better sense of smell than men, and that our sense of smell actually peaks during ovulation.
Interesting, isn't it?
Maybe an evolutionary advantage. Sniff out the best mate,
Could be. But we also have to factor in adaptation. We get used to smells incredibly quickly, like 50% within the first second.
Ugh, tell me about it. I love scented candles, but after like 5 minutes, I can barely smell them.
It's so frustrating.
It is. So what's going on there?
Likely is due to changes in both the receptors themselves and also our brain connections.
So it's like they're saying, okay, we get it. This is lavender. No need to keep reminding us.
Exactly, like sensory overload.
Makes sense. So Dr. Eldeeb says to notice a difference, we need a pretty big change in concentration, like 30%. All right, well, let's move on to taste, the other half of the flavor equation. And it's more than just our tongues, right?
You got it. Taste buds are actually also on the soft palate, the epiglottis, even the pharynx.
Wow, didn't know that. I always just picture the tongue.
Well, it makes sense when you think about it. They're all involved in tasting and swallowing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so taste buds, they're these tiny groups of receptor cells, and they have a little opening called a taste pore.
Taste pore. Okay. So does each taste bud detect all the different tastes?
Not quite. There are different types of taste buds, and each one is sensitive to a specific taste.
Ah, makes sense. Which brings us to the famous 5: sweet, sour, salty, bitter,
And umami.
and umami. The taste of all things savory. I'm actually excited to unpack this one.
That's a good one.
All right, but let's start with the classics. Sour. Just the word makes my mouth pucker.
Yeah.
What's happening there, like on a cellular level when we taste something sour?
So sourness is triggered by acids, right? Like think of a lemon. And what happens is those H+ ions from the acid, they actually block potassium channels in the sour taste receptors.
Potassium channels. That sounds complicated.
Well, basically those channels help control the flow of ions in and out of the cell. And when they get blocked, that sends a signal to the brain saying, hey, this is sour.
Okay, it's like a little alarm bell going off. What about salty? I'm picturing potato chips. Is it just sodium that triggers that salty sensation?
Sodium's definitely the main player there. And it works by causing an influx of sodium ions. So more sodium rushes into the cell, and that depolarizes the salt receptors.
Depolarizes, man.
It disrupts the electrical charge of the cell. And that disruption, that change in charge, is what sends that salty signal to the brain.
So it's like an electrical charge that says salty. Interesting. What about sweet? All those sugary treats, cakes and candies. Is it a similar process?
Sweetness is a bit more complex, actually.
Yeah.
It involves this whole cascade of events. So it starts with the activation of an enzyme called adenosylase.
Okay, adenyl cyclase.
Yeah, big word, I know. And this enzyme increases a molecule called KMP inside those taste receptor cells. And that ultimately signals sweetness to your brain.
Wow, so there's a whole chain reaction happening just for us to experience sweetness? That's pretty incredible. What about bitter tastes? I have a friend who can't even handle dark chocolate because it's too bitter for her.
Bitterness is interesting. It's actually very tied to our survival instincts.
Survival instincts.
Yeah, because a lot of poisonous substances are bitter, so it acts as kind of a warning signal like, hey, don't eat this.
That makes sense.
And the mechanism behind bitterness, it involves another pathway with something called phospholipase C and calcium ions playing key roles.
So even our taste bugs are hardwired for self-preservation. Okay, let's circle back to that 5th taste, umami. What makes it so unique?
Oh, umami, it's that savory, satisfying taste we find in foods like mushrooms, broth, aged cheeses, even tomatoes. And what's unique is its trigger, which is glutamate.
Glutamate. And didn't you mention MSG earlier?
Right. MSG is actually a concentrated form of glutamate, which is why it adds such a powerful punch of umami to food.
I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. But remember those taste maps we all learned in school, the tongue diagrams? Like different parts of the tongue responsible for different tastes? Are those actually accurate?
Not really. Those maps are way oversimplified. While different areas of the tongue might be slightly more sensitive to certain tastes, all the tastes can actually be detected across the entire tongue.
So it's less like a map, more like a taste mosaic. So how do all those taste signals get from our tongues to our brains?
It's a bit of a multi-step journey. So signals from different areas of the tongue, they travel along different nerves. The front 2/3 of the tongue that uses the chordae tympani nerve,
Okay, I'm writing this down.
which is actually part of the facial nerve, and then the back third of the tongue uses the glossopharyngeal nerve.
So different highways, but the same destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All those signals, they eventually meet up at this place called the solitary nucleus, which is in the brainstem.
Okay, the solitary nucleus.
Yep. And from there, they go to the thalamus.
Yeah.
You know, that sensory relay station we talked about earlier. And then finally, they reach the sensory cortex, where we consciously experience taste.
It's amazing how all those signals come together to create one unified taste sensation. But just like smell, our sense of taste adapts too, right? Like that first bite is always the most intense.
You're right. And it's interesting because unlike smell adaptation, which happens both in the receptors and the brain,
Right, you mentioned that.
Taste adaptation is mainly due to changes in the receptors themselves. They basically become less sensitive over time.
Ah, okay. So each sense has its own quirks.
They do. But what happens when things go wrong with our sense of taste?
Like when you can't taste anything at all.
Exactly. There are actually specific terms for those conditions.
Oh, like what?
So ageusia, that's the complete loss of taste. Then there's hypogeusia, which is a reduced sense of taste.
Yeah.
And then dysgeusia, that's a distorted sense of taste, so things taste different than they should.
Hmm. Those all sound pretty unpleasant. Are those conditions permanent or can they be temporary?
Depends on the cause. Some medications can actually temporarily cause taste loss.
Really?
Yeah, Dr. Eldeeb mentions captopril, which is a blood pressure medication.
Wow, that's a side effect I'd never considered. I can only imagine how confusing that would make mealtime.
It definitely would. But speaking of confusing, have you ever thought about how losing one sense might affect the other in ways we don't even realize?
That's a really interesting question. Like, if you couldn't smell, would food taste different?
Exactly. Remember, a huge part of what we think of as taste actually comes from our sense of smell. So if that sense is compromised, our whole perception of flavor changes dramatically.
Wow, you've given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much we take our senses for granted. They're really remarkable systems.
They are. And the more we learn about how they work, the more we can appreciate just how intricate the world of sensory perception really is.
We're back, ready to keep exploring this fascinating world of smell and taste. It's amazing how much our sense of smell shapes our everyday experiences without us even realizing it.
It really does. Think about how a familiar scent can suddenly unlock like a super vivid memory.
Oh, totally. Or how walking past a bakery can make your mouth water even before you see the pastries.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like our sense of smell has this direct line to our emotions and our stomachs.
So true. Have you ever noticed how certain scents can make you feel instantly relaxed or like energized?
Absolutely. And those are perfect examples of how our sense of smell, it triggers both physiological and emotional responses.
I never thought about it that way.
There's a whole area of research dedicated to this. Like studies are showing certain scents can actually alter brainwave activity, even affect hormone levels.
Wow, so it's not just about like enjoying pleasant smells.
Yeah.
Our brains are actually processing that olfactory information in these complex ways. But let's go back to the mechanics of smell for a minute. We talked about those olfactory receptors in our noses. But just how many different smells are we actually able to detect?
Ooh, that's a great question. And kind of a tricky one to answer definitively.
How so?
Well, we have hundreds of different olfactory receptor types, and each one is kind of tuned to detect specific odor molecules or groups of molecules.
Okay.
So when we encounter a scent, it's actually a unique combination of those receptors that gets activated. And that creates a kind of neural signature for that smell in our brains.
So it's like this complex code
Right?
where different combinations of receptors create different smell perceptions. So do we have any idea how many smells we can actually discriminate between?
Well, there isn't a single smell dictionary that maps out every possibility.
There aren't.
Scientists estimate that humans can discriminate between thousands, maybe even millions, of different smells.
Millions. That's incredible. Our noses are way more powerful than I ever imagined. But I'm curious about how our sense of smell changes throughout the day. Is it constant or does it, like, fluctuate?
It can actually vary quite a bit depending on a few different factors.
Like what?
For example, it's generally sharper in the morning and then kind of becomes less acute as the day goes on.
Interesting. So that explains why I always wake up craving pancakes.
Maybe. But seriously, our sense of smell is also affected by things like hormonal fluctuations, especially in women.
Makes sense. What about our emotional state? Can that affect our sense of smell?
Absolutely. When we're feeling stressed or anxious, for example, our sense of smell might become heightened, like our body's on high alert trying to process every bit of information.
That's so true. I definitely feel like I'm hyper aware of every smell when I'm stressed.
It's a survival mechanism.
Is it also true that our sense of smell declines as we age?
Unfortunately, yeah. As we get older, the number of those olfactory receptors in our noses, it naturally decreases.
Ah, that makes sense.
And that leads to a gradual decline in our ability to detect and, distinguish between smells.
That's kind of sad. But I guess it's part of life, right?
It is.
Well, let's shift gears back to taste for a moment. We've been discussing the 5 basic tastes. But are there any other tastes that scientists are exploring? Like, are there more than just 5?
There's definitely some ongoing research into other potential taste categories.
Oh, like what?
For instance, some researchers believe there might be a specific taste for fat, which they call oleogustus.
Oleogustus. I love that word.
And there's also some evidence suggesting that we might be able to perceive the taste of calcium.
A taste for fat. That's fascinating. Could this explain why some people find fatty foods so irresistible?
It's definitely a possibility.
I know I can never say no to French fries.
Uh-huh. But, more research is needed to fully understand the role of oleogustus in our food preferences and how it might contribute to things like cravings.
Makes sense.
And same goes for the potential taste for calcium. It's still an area of active investigation.
It seems like there's so much we still don't know about smell and taste.
Yeah.
But what we've learned so far is truly remarkable.
Absolutely. And as we continue to learn more, it just deepens our appreciation for the complexity and the importance of these sensory systems.
Speaking of complexity, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about how our senses of smell and taste are intertwined. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. So as we've been discussing, flavor isn't just about what our taste buds perceive.
Right.
When we eat, odor molecules from the food actually travel up our nasal passages to those olfactory receptors.
Up the back of our throats, basically.
Yeah. And this process, it's called retronasal olfaction. And it provides us with a much richer understanding of the food's aroma than we get from just, sniffing it beforehand.
So it's like our sense of smell gets a second chance to analyze the food once it's in our mouths.
Exactly. And that retronasal olfactory input, it combines with the signals from our taste buds to create that complex perception of flavor that we experience.
Oh, okay. That makes so much sense. It explains why food tastes so bland when we have a stuffy nose. We're missing that whole olfactory component of the flavor.
Precisely. And it just highlights how interconnected these two senses are in creating our culinary experiences. It's a true partnership.
It really is. I'm starting to think about food in a whole new way now.
Good.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear that. It's amazing how much we can learn about ourselves and the world around us by just paying closer attention to our senses.
Well said. There's always something new to discover.
Always.
And we're back for our final deep dive into the senses of smell and taste. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more tuned into my senses after all this.
I know what you mean.
Yeah,
You start to realize just how much we take these senses for granted.
for sure. And they're so connected to everything, our memories, emotions, even our survival.
Exactly. We've been talking about how smells can trigger those really vivid memories and how taste helps us, figure out which foods are good for us and which ones to avoid.
Right. But what about the more subtle ways that smell and taste work together? Can our sense of smell actually influence what we taste?
Absolutely. There's this fascinating thing called odor-induced taste enhancement.
Odor-induced taste enhancement?
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But essentially it means the presence of a particular aroma can actually make a food taste sweeter or saltier or just more intense overall.
Oh, okay, I think I get it. So, like, if strawberries smell super sweet, they'll actually taste even sweeter because of that aroma.
That's a perfect example. That aroma, it's like it primes your taste buds to expect a certain level of sweetness, so the actual taste is even more noticeable.
So it's like our senses are having a conversation, working together to create this whole taste experience.
Exactly. It's pretty amazing. And this interplay between smell and taste, it's something that chefs and food scientists are really starting to explore.
Oh, interesting. So they're using this knowledge to make food even more delicious.
Exactly. Creating more innovative dishes, playing with flavor combinations.
So it's not just about the ingredients themselves, but how those aromas and tastes all work together.
Right. This whole idea of sensory perception has led to some really cool developments in the culinary world. Have you heard of molecular gastronomy?
I've heard of it, but don't really know much about it.
Well, it's basically where chefs use scientific principles to create these, unexpected flavor combinations and textures.
Wow, that's cool. So science and art can come together to create some really delicious experiences.
Exactly. It's all about pushing the boundaries of flavor.
I love that. But stepping outside of the world of food for a minute, are there other ways that smell and taste impact our lives?
Good question. Well, think about pheromones.
Pheromones. Okay, remind me what those are again.
So pheromones are these chemical signals that animals, including humans, release to communicate with each other.
Oh, right, like a silent language.
Yeah. And while there's still a lot of debate about how much of a role pheromones play in human behavior, there's growing evidence that they might influence things like mate selection and social interactions.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's like the secret subconscious language of scent that we're not even aware of.
Exactly. It really shows you how powerful and mysterious the whole world of scent can be.
For sure. We've only scratched the surface of understanding how these signals might be shaping our behavior.
Right.
This whole journey has been so fascinating. We've gone from talking about taste buds and olfactory receptors all the way to like the impact of smell and taste on our everyday lives.
It really shows you how much we can learn by, taking a closer look at the things we might consider ordinary.
I totally agree. So as we wrap up, I'm curious, what's next for smell and taste research? What are some of the exciting frontiers?
Ooh, there are so many. For example, scientists are working on developing these artificial noses.
Artificial noses, that sounds kind of sci-fi.
It is, but there are these high-tech devices that could be used to detect all sorts of things. Diseases, environmental toxins, even explosives, with incredible accuracy.
Wow, so it's like having this super-powered smell detective.
Exactly.
What about on the taste front?
Well, there's a lot of research focused on actually manipulating taste perception.
Manipulating, like changing how things taste.
Yes. Imagine being able to help people eat healthier or manage conditions like obesity and diabetes by actually changing how food tastes.
Wow, that would be incredible. Could we one day make vegetables taste like chocolate cake?
Ah, who knows?
Yeah.
It's definitely a possibility. The more we unravel those mysteries of our senses, the more we open up all these incredible possibilities.
It sounds like there's a lot to look forward to.
There is.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about today and maybe even smell and taste differently.
I hope so.
Thanks for joining us on this sensory adventure. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those senses sharp.